Welcome to our first of 3 forums this fall on housing. I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Joe Grotta, who's the co-chair of our housing committee and is also the CEO of Atlantic Mechanical Contractors out of Weymouth. He will get us started today and go through some of the program and kick us off for a good discussion. Thanks again for coming.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney. Just want to welcome everybody. This is part of a 3-part series, all of which looks absolutely outstanding. I'm Joe Grotta, and as Courtney said, I run Atlantic Mechanical. So we are a trade. We do heating, venting, air conditioning, refrigeration, included for housing facilities, in addition to a series of other commercial clients. I'm also the developer of Weston Park Apartments in Weymouth Landing, an area that's seen a lot of changes since zoning has been altered. That's sort of facilitated a lot of development in that area. I mean, there's about 350 units that have been added to that area. So you can see how much of a difference some of these things can make. I have a strong interest in housing because of these 2 pieces and because economic development for our area is dependent on having the proper housing initiative behind it. So with regards to the Chamber and South Shore 2030, which is essentially the initiative that we built in order to encourage this type of housing to continue to exist and continue to develop and grow so that we can facilitate a better workforce, we can facilitate a better economic development scenario and environment for everyone and all the businesses that are related to it. The South Shore Chamber has put together this 2030 plan. And the Chamber is a small nonprofit with a huge reach. You know, we have around 1,300 members, and we represent businesses in all these 25 communities south of Boston. Our mission is to support the growth of our members' businesses, their employees, the business community at large through advocacy, making connections and collaboration. It's a member-driven chamber. It's funded by its members and partner businesses. Members range in size. We have very small companies to major international corporations that are headquartered on the South Shore. And if anyone is not already a member of the chamber, I do encourage you to join, not just because you get to affiliate yourself with some of these fantastic companies, but the connections that you make are fantastic. Not only that, but you'd actually be supporting your own business, your own community, and the rest of the businesses and communities that exist here on the South Shore. It gives us that sort of competitive advantage from a geographic standpoint to be able to promote where we live and where we work. So it is it's a hugely helpful organization to be a part of for a number of reasons. It's more than your traditional business-to-business networking organization. I know it gets that sort of reputation. It's not really the sort of heart of what we do. The heart of what we do is creating the environment that makes us sort of a better place to live and work. With important data from National Research Group, we now have a roadmap to create the right environment for current future businesses to thrive. That's what our 2030 plan is all about. This roadmap plan builds on the idea that businesses do well in and new businesses locate to communities where there's a healthy supply of talent, which has to do with their housing facilities. So without housing, transportation, infrastructure, then there's no way we can actually grow as a community. There's no way that we can see our economic development really take place. What we're all looking for is that environment that's going to give us that sort of advantage by being where we are. So the plan's focused on encouraging greater housing options to attract our next generation of workers. We're seeing that happen in Weymouth Landing. I can tell you firsthand that's precisely what's happening. I'm doing the showings myself, so I'm seeing all these young couples come here. And especially with the mobility that we're now seeing and it's sort of a silver lining on the COVID environment that's created, there is this work from home mentality that's going to be sort of part of our new normal. So we have a unique opportunity here to create an environment where these people are going to be able to work from home in comfortable places. So the commute no longer becomes that large of a deciding factor. It's important for us to be able to have our housing initiative sort of accelerated, to be able to create more housing for the younger and the next generation of workers. It's exciting work. I'm super proud to be a part of it. Like I said, I get to see some of these results right at the ground level, which is absolutely fantastic, extremely encouraging. I do want to take a moment here because all of this work that we've been able to build is because of the housing funders and 2030 funders that make a part of it. You can see some of them on your screen right now. So this 3-part series where we all get to learn about how these things can be impactful. We look at Rockland Trust Bank, Massachusetts Housing Partnership, Cape Cod Lumber, Fire King Bakery, and Sullivan Tire. And our 2030 general funders listed on the screen right in front of you. So none of this important work would be possible without these partners. These partners give us the ability to fund some of the things that create the roadmap that we're following right now, that we're walking along, that we're actually making progress on, despite some of the hindrances that we've come across, some once in a generation. They drive our mission to make the South Shore a more vibrant place to live and work for generations to come, not just for us right now, but for the people we're trying to encourage to come here and be a part of. And as you see these demographics shift, as you see these worlds change a little bit, it's really encouraging to see what we've been able to accomplish in just a short time. So if you have an interest in learning more about this, please drop a note in the chat. Someone here will be able to help you. You can certainly reach out to me. My email is joe@grottapropertymanagement.com. Feel free to shoot a note out there. I'm happy to take any calls and answer any questions or go over some of the specifics of the work that we're doing now. So just as a reminder of what we're doing for today. In a moment, you'll hear a presentation from David Glick. He's an associate professor at Boston University. I'm going to ask that you hold your questions and comments until the end of the presentation. Obviously, this sort of Zoom environment is not going to allow us to be able to do our standard. They have a raise your hand function, which we're going to ask you to use. At that time, Judy Barrett, owner of Barrett Planning Group, and one of the Chamber's Housing Committee members will step in to help lead and facilitate the discussion. So we'll be able to go through those questions as they come up at the end of the presentation. So please use that raise hand function, and let's keep the conversation constructive and relevant. So I'd like to introduce David. We're very happy to have him with us today. Associate Professor David Glick from Boston University. He's in the Department of Political Science. He grew up near Boston. He went to graduate school at Princeton and undergrad at Williams College. Prior to joining BU, he worked as a strategy consultant with the Monitor Group and as a fellow at the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy at Dartmouth. He's part of a team that established the Neighborhood Defenders Research last year, looking at data to examine the dominance of land use politics by neighborhood defenders, individuals who oppose new housing projects far more strongly than their broader communities. At this time, I'd like to invite David to introduce himself, tell us a little bit more about their findings and their research. He'll also update us on the impacts COVID has had on public meetings across the Commonwealth. And finally, we'll wrap up with some thoughts and broader conversation on why getting involved in your public meeting process is critical to shaping your and our community and increasing our housing options for future generations. David?
Great, thank you. Let me share my screen. I have a few slides. Hopefully, is that coming up for people? No. Hold on one second. Try that again. Full screen here. Okay, yeah. Okay, great. So thank you. That introduction was great. I don't think I have too much more to add other than that as Joe did the part I was afraid I was going to have to mention, which is all of this is in collaboration with my two great BU colleagues, Professors Catherine Levine-Einstein and Maxwell Palmer. We work together on a variety of things in the political science department and in the Initiative on Cities, which is a center at the university. I'll mention a bit more in a moment. And so this sort of what I'll talk about for the next, hopefully no more than 15 or 20 minutes, kind of reflects our work. Obviously, I'm not going to summarize our whole book, but I'll talk a little bit about our research into housing politics and sort of the very local politics of housing and public meetings. And as I told Courtney as we were planning this, I'm obviously happy to answer questions. So if you have questions about whatever, about the book, about the methodology, those types of things, but I'm hoping more that this will start a discussion. Many of the folks in the audience probably have much better and more interesting experience with public meetings than we do as kind of outside analysts, and hopefully this will tee up a conversation as much amongst all of you as it is with me about the research. So okay, I will try to move through this relatively quickly. Basically, I'll do a bit of an introduction here, sort of big picture on housing. Again, living in Eastern Mass, obviously many of us are intimately familiar with with high housing costs and in various ways how they affect our lives sometimes. And then I'll talk, I'll sum up the book, talk a little bit about some of the research we did, and really keep the focus on the neighborhood meetings part. And then, I'll end by kind of summarizing and highlighting a couple potential discussion points, couple discussions about potential reforms, and as Joe mentioned, a little preview of some work we've been doing about online meetings, sort of since COVID started, as these neighborhood meetings and public meetings have gone virtual. So, okay, big picture, right? How we sort of think about housing policy, right, is that it's obviously about access to housing, but that comes with lots of other things, right? There's, for those who are interested in climate change, housing policy is a good place to look. It affects commuting, it affects transportation, all sorts of things like that, right? Social mobility is tied up in housing policy, right? Some parts of the country, some neighborhoods, some cities, some regions offer more opportunities through education and otherwise for social mobility. Often those are the places that are the hardest to afford to live. So access to housing affects kind of intergenerational social mobility, right? It also affects health, as we are seeing all too strongly over the last few months, right? And finally, obviously, these things all fit together, right? It has, you know, direct and indirect sort of economic impacts, right? And I'm just going to include this quote here from a New York Times op-ed from a couple economists, right, who have tried to put a price tag on the cost of essentially land use restrictions that make it hard to build housing. And their basic argument, and this applies to the Bay Area, it applies to the Boston area and a few other places, right, is that basically the cost of housing just creates a big mismatch between where the jobs are and where the opportunities are and where people can actually afford to live. And basically, just as a country, as a society, we leave a lot of money on the table because we can't match workers. Workers can't afford to live where the high productivity jobs are, basically, right? We are political scientists, so we're interested in housing politics, and some of you have probably experienced this in various ways in your own lives, right? But for what it's worth, right, housing politics we think are sort of extra challenging, right? They're often what we would call zero sum. There's winners and losers, right? Someone's values go up, someone else gets to live somewhere they might not otherwise have, or someone's values go down, right? Their retirement savings might not pan out as much as I had hoped. On the other hand, other people get to live somewhere they might not have been able to live, right? There are identifiable sort of trade-offs, right? And of course, unlike some other aspects of politics and policy, right, we all have sort of emotional connections to our homes and to our neighborhoods, and these are real realities as well, right? And finally, you know, there's at least two big conversations about housing, right? One is on the subsidized side, and one is more on the market-based side. Just as a preview, right, I'm going to focus on the market-based housing side of things today, right? That still, as we know in Eastern Mass, includes a variety of price ranges, but there's a whole different conversations around government subsidies and subsidized housing and vouchers and all of those issues, which we are focusing on market-based. So before I get to the book, I just wanted to flag a bit of other work that we at BU have done to put this in kind of a national perspective. Again, we don't have data about, you know, priorities on the South Shore or even, you know, enough data points in Massachusetts to speak to that on this particular issues. But one of the things the center we're affiliated with at BU does every year is a national survey of mayors, right? And not just mayors of gigantic cities, right? So mayors of cities over 75,000 people, which I realize, again, there's only a few of those in Massachusetts. So it's still, you know, we can only speak, you know, this is more kind of big picture national things, but we've asked mayors a number of questions about housing. And one thing, if any of you ever, you know, this is not a data point, but kind of an anecdote, right? We find in doing these surveys over the years that there's some issues that mayors are really good at talking about and clearly think a lot about and know a lot about, and others that they don't. And I guess what we tell people is, if you ever run into a mayor and want to get them talking, ask them about housing. They know their neighborhoods. They know that, you know, they know a lot about housing. You know, down to the block level. I guess it's, you know, it overlaps with the politics, obviously. So a couple of years ago, we asked them name the top few reasons why people leave your cities, why they move out. It's easy for them to talk about the good things in their cities. We tried to ask them the opposite. And housing costs were the biggest one, right? And again, this is not just mayors of cities in the Bay Area or in Eastern Massachusetts, right? This is across the country. Mayors cite housing costs as a big reason that drives people out of their community, right? So again, big picture, right? We also asked mayors how well the housing stock in their cities, and again, this is a range of communities that have, you know, some have big, tall apartment buildings, some are basically suburban communities that are big enough to fit into our survey, right? Almost no mayors think that their current housing stock matches what their residents want, right? Joe kind of talked about some of those changes, right? The demand for multifamily housing, for different types of housing, for different lifestyles. This is all part of it, right? And finally, right, more specific to multifamily housing, this graph is a bit more complicated, so I'll spend 30 seconds on it. We basically asked mayors, looking forward, of all the new housing that gets built in your community, how much would you like to be single family versus multifamily, right? So those are each red dot is what one mayor said. So they're, frequently they're saying at least half of the new housing they want built, they would like to be sort of multifamily style housing, right? The blue dots are what their cities have done in recent years, what percent of their housing is multifamily, right? So they're almost all saying their sort of aspirations for multifamily housing are quite far from the reality of what they're currently building, right? So there's a mismatch here, right? So this is all kind of big picture background, again, not specific to Massachusetts, not specific to the South Shore, but hopefully some sort of helpful context. Okay, so focusing on our book, and I'm going to start with a sort of fun slide here. If there are any fans of the show Parks and Rec, right? It's the best show about local government. Those who are might remember this. Those who are not, I'll try to give the very brief version, right? Which is in the final season of the show. There's this kind of implication that there's a big fight between the two main characters, and it takes them a few episodes to tell us what it's about, right? And in probably the 4th or 5th episode of the season, it turns out it's a fight about zoning and neighborhood meetings and building multifamily housing, right? This is what it's actually about, right? That one of the characters has moved on from city government and is now a developer, right? And this is the exchange they had, right? And basically, to some extent, this exchange is kind of what we wrote our book about, right? Is these disputes between people who, right? The main character, Leslie Knope, says, I built this nice park, right? And your building is going to ruin the views. And Ron Swanson, the developer, says, right, you built a nice place and people want to live near there and the world needs apartment buildings. And then she says, right, you're going to spend the next 2 years or have spent 2 years fighting zoning laws to try to get this thing built, right? This is basically, this is not the inspiration for the book, but to a large extent, as I'll make clear in a minute, this is these types of politics, the politics of individual proposals for sometimes big apartment buildings, sometimes accessory apartments, sometimes subdivisions of single family homes, right? This is basically what we wrote a book about, is exactly these type of things, right? And again, the intensity of this, that they got in this big fight about it, is kind of part of the point, right? That these are hyper local politics, right? They take place at the neighborhood level, they take place at the community level. Pre-COVID, they take place in, public meetings that kind of look like this, right? And and they matter, and they have big consequences for people, right? And probably many of you have participated perhaps in one way or another. Right. And so the focus of our book is basically this question of how do local participatory processes, right, the way we often approve housing proposals in Massachusetts and elsewhere, how do they affect what gets built and where it gets built, right? And, to skip ahead 5 minutes, right, the punchline is public meetings like the one pictured on the left, right? They certainly have some positives, but part of our conclusion is that our data shows that they empower an unrepresentative group to sort of slow down, stop, and shrink proposals, right? Essentially, raising housing costs, limiting housing supply, and affecting what gets built and where, right? And so this is probably the most academic-y slide, hopefully, of the whole thing. There will be a couple data, but they're really straightforward. I'll tell you a bit about what we did in a minute. But kind of in the academic world, I'm going to simplify a lot here. There's kind of 2 big perspectives on housing supply. So one is kind of what tends to be more the economist side, which is to focus on land use regulations, right? Zoning rules, where you can build multifamily, things like that, right? This, I grabbed a picture of the Plymouth zoning on the left here, right? And, intuitively, the economists say, loosen the land use regulations, make it easier to build more housing. You'll get more housing supply, lower housing costs, access to all kinds of things, right? Makes sense. Frequently on the political science side, and sometimes probably even more on kind of the popular debate side, right? You may have heard the term NIMBY, right? This is more the kind of politics, the psychology, right? The individuals who get upset and oppose or have concerns about, right, what's going to happen to their neighborhood, right? And these are kind of 2 big, you may have heard these 2 big perspectives on kind of the social science of housing markets, essentially, right? And the short version of our argument, which is really the whole thing, is that both are true, right? Land use regulations affect housing supply, and these types of attitudes, which we think, tend to be just kind of natural and inevitable, they also matter, right? But the part we want to focus on, and the point of our, why we're all here today, right, is public meetings, right? Which we call and described in the book as sort of well-intentioned participatory institutions, right? These ways of approving housing proposals, which frequently, right, many proposals that aren't for sort of relatively straightforward one single family home end up in either a planning board proposal to get a special permit or a zoning board process to get a variance, and sometimes both, right? You see plenty of projects that actually have to go through both processes, right? And the history of these institutions comes out of a very different period where kind of developers ruled and did what, in conjunction with city leaders, and basically did what they wanted and literally and figuratively kind of bulldozed neighborhoods and residents and things like that, right? And so these rules evolved to give more voice to local residents, right? And our argument is essentially, which again I'll get to at the very end, is that they've maybe gone, there've been some unintended consequences. I'll just put it that way, right? And so basically what happens, right, is it's very natural for people who live near any proposal, whether it's a big building or something relatively modest, right, are naturally going to care about, right? We all care about what happens on our streets. We are all affected by if our neighbor's doing construction. We all might have concerns about parking or traffic or safety or our views or things like that, right? And so it's quite natural that a few local opponents will be very motivated to have concerns, and that the benefits of these types of things are quite diffuse, right? In the long run, right? Every proposal that builds a few more units of housing affects prices and makes areas more accessible and brings more workers and has all kinds of benefits, right? But any particular project is going to have very diffuse and spread out benefits that most people won't even realize, and the people who might benefit the most don't even live in the community because they haven't moved there yet because they can't, and the people who live nearby are going to care a lot, right? This is basically the kind of structure we focus on, right? And that more land use regulations means more meetings, right? If the more hurdles you have to go through, the more things that might be wrong with your proposal means it's more likely to end up in a meeting, and once it ends up in a meeting, all kinds of things can happen, right? Put differently, right? People who object to proposals can only do so much without meetings and institutions that give them an opportunity, give them influence, right? And even regulations may not matter that much unless there are people who are there to kind of invoke and sort of bring them forward, right? And this is again why public meetings matter, and how they fit into these discussions about NIMBYs, how they fit into these discussions about land use regulations, how all the pieces fit together. Right, so we start the book with this case study from Cambridge. This is a warehouse in Porter Square, right? A very sort of high demand residential area. This is not a particularly attractive warehouse, right? And basically a developer wanted to turn this warehouse, right? You can see right next to it is residential, right? Into four pretty high-end condominiums, each with one parking spot, right? And this is just our example, right? Of a sort of representative project in some ways, right? It's a 4-unit project. It's not a giant development. It's not a high-rise tower of apartments. This is really the heart of the book, is these types of proposals that happen in Cambridge. They happen in Brookline. They happen on the South Shore. They happen in Worcester, right? These are not giant towers, right? And so basically what happened at this meeting is the zoning board asked some pretty technocratic questions, didn't seem to have too many concerns, right? And then as part of the process, right, it opened up to the public, right? And not surprisingly, right, people who live on the street had some concerns, and they were well informed, they were well prepared, they had done their research, they were knowledgeable, right? This is, all these types of things, right? And so, they raised the concerns that we might expect, right? About parking, about, we're not showing all the quotes here, but about construction costs and so on and so forth. Right, and so what looked like a meeting that the board didn't seem to have any concerns about was moving along smoothly. Ended up with the board saying, let's pause for a few months, go do some more studies, developer, right, negotiate with the neighbors. Ultimately, what ended up happening here is this 4-unit proposal with 1 parking space each turned into 3 even more luxury condos, each with 2 parking spaces each, right? And of course, you might say, right, what's the big deal from 4 to 3? But again, if this process happens every time someone tries to build housing, and every time someone tries to build 4 units of housing, you end up with 3 units of housing, and this happens over and over again in every town in Eastern Massachusetts, right? That's a lot, let alone all the proposals that never even get put forward because potential developers know this might happen or the economics might fall apart or so on, right? And so again, this slide kind of shows the summary of all of that, right? And again, our I think hopefully sort of balanced and descriptive take on these processes is there's absolutely no doubt that this sometimes improves bad proposals. It sometimes means bad projects don't get built. It sometimes means environmental concerns that need to get raised. It sometimes means that concerns that only the neighbors could possibly know about come to the fore, right? But also, as I said, repeated over and over again in a variety of ways, whether it's shrinking proposals, whether it means 6 months of delays, whether it means certain things never get proposed, or whether it means, right, 4 what would have been very expensive condos in Cambridge turn into 3 even more expensive condos in Cambridge, right? It affects the housing market. And so again, this, there's sort of 2 processes here, right? Planning board for special permits and zoning board of appeals for variances. And we took a quick look before I get to the bigger data. This was something we were really interested in, is kind of, what happens once the meeting starts. So we took a look at, we just picked 100 projects from across Eastern Massachusetts and looked at sort of what got them into meetings in the first place, and then what did the meetings end up talking about, right? And I'm going to focus on the bottom part here just to save time, right, on the zoning board. Most of the projects that we found going in front of zoning boards required variances for things like setbacks, like the distance from the street or the sidewalk, or lot size or the shape of the lot, things, those type of things, right? But at 68% of those meetings, they ended up talking about parking. Almost as frequently, they ended up talking about aesthetics and neighborhood character and things like this. So this is, we think, consistent with our argument that once the regulations lead to meetings, and then the meetings lead to all kinds of concerns, some probably valid, some probably less valid, all getting raised, right? And that's kind of, again, I think a nice example of how the pieces fit together and why these meetings matter, even if it doesn't seem like a meeting about the dimensions of a lot is going to turn into much or should matter all that much. Okay, so finally, the big part of the research, right? The core of the book, and I will go through this quickly. Right, our big question ultimately, right, is sort of who does government hear from in this process? Are the participants, the people who show up at these meetings, right, in Cambridge and everywhere else, representative of their communities demographically, and do they share the same views about these issues as their communities, right? And so how did we do this? This is where the hard work came in, right? Massachusetts is nice for a variety of reasons, one of which it has pretty good public meeting laws, right? You can go find the, depends on the city or town, but pretty detailed, sometimes very detailed, sometimes exact transcripts of planning and zoning board meetings. Sometimes there are videos. So we picked 3 years and collected every meeting minute we could find from basically every city and town in Eastern Mass, except for Boston. Boston has a different process. So Boston is not in the data. This is not all from the big city, right? Worcester is the biggest city in the data, but most of the observations come from western suburbs, North Shore, South Shore, right? These are, again, not big condo buildings in the city of Boston, right? We looked at the discussion for every proposal to build more than 1 unit of housing. So again, I think this is important. This is not just objection to gigantic, gigantic new developments or towers or things like that, right? Many of these are actually suburban subdivisions where they were trying to just build more than 1 unit of single family housing at a time. We included those, right? So this is where you'd expect kind of the least opposition, right? We all know you're going to get the most opposition to big apartment complexes and things like that, right? And so we read every one of these meeting minutes. We coded, we made a big database of who participated and what they said. Doing so allowed us to match to other databases, so we could see, property records and things like that, right? And this included a data set of about 3,500 people making 4,300 comments about multifamily housing, right? So what we were able to do is compare the people who spoke at these meetings to the people who were registered to vote in their communities. So, right, you see the first column there is kind of the demographics of the people who comment. The second column there is the demographics of all voters in their community, and the third column there is the difference, right? And so that you can see that people who participate in these meetings are less likely to be women, more likely to be white, much more likely to be over 50, and much more likely to be homeowners, right? Again, this probably fits in a lot of ways, right? We're not, I think in some ways this is just, in a good way, hopefully, a lot of work to confirm probably what a lot of people stereotype these meetings to to look like, but the data shows that, right? Interestingly, there's no party differences in who shows up. There's also no home value differences in who shows up. So once you're in the realm of homeowners, the amount of equity people have in their homes doesn't affect their likelihood of showing up, right? And kind of back to that sort of NIMBY and local question, right? We were able to look at the very micro geography of these things, right? So 82% of people roughly live in the neighborhood where the proposal was made, and 41% of people live on the same block, right? So this is very, very local, you know, dominated by people who live extremely close to. That's who government's doing, right? We also kept track of what they said and tried to make a rough sense of if they were speaking in support, kind of neutral, you know, asking a question or saying something oppositional, right? About 2/3 of comments at these public meetings that government hears are negative, right? We can come back to this slide if people want to look at it more carefully, but we tried to sort of break these into categories so you can see, right, what the types of things opponents talk about, for example, over there on the right, the type of things supporters tend to talk about on the left, right? Again, probably fits what some people would expect, you know, traffic, parking, those types of things, neighborhood character. And again, you know, that's, again, probably fits with some experiences, but hopefully at the discussion, some folks might have some thoughts on that, right? And finally, right, one question is always, you know, how representative are these folks of the community, and how different is it when you ask like a big picture question versus a individual project level question, right, which is what we're focused on. So some of you may remember a few years ago, Massachusetts had a statewide referendum on Proposition 40B, which is in a lot of ways probably a more aggressive pro-affordable housing and you know, pro-relaxing zoning regulations to build housing than a lot of these variances and things like that, right? And so we matched up the percent of comments in each community that were positive with how that community voted on Proposition 40B, right? So that dotted line is if the level of comments basically matched up with how they voted on the Prop 40B. Anything below the line is the community showed more support for Prop 40B than kind of the, you know, balance of comments at public meetings. And as you can see, there's one weird community on there. It might have been a coding error. I'm not even sure, right? There's only one. All the rest, and some of them are way down there at the bottom, right? There are some places like Cambridge that voted about 80% for Prop 40B and that are, you know, 30, 40% supportive comments, right? There's nobody above the line. Most communities are way below the line. So, right, interesting difference between big picture voting and project by project processes, right? So, finally, just to sum up, right? Again, you know, I think, right, these concerns are natural and reasonable and often really important, right? We all have them, but our argument is due to the way, and some are of course less reasonable, but due to the way institutions are structured, frequently this is maybe the only thing that government hears is the negative, right? And that, again, coming back to sort of the 50s and 60s, these processes that were originally designed to protect vulnerable people from powerful developers have created new types of inequality in which sort of long-term residents who have owned houses in their communities for a while are the only ones that government officials hear from and that they tend to oppose housing. So some things, right, that we think are kind of natural implications, although again, I'm eager to hear where the conversation goes, right? But this is kind of a tricky balance, right? In general, as a society, right, we want people to participate. We often complain that people don't participate enough in politics and that government isn't responsive enough. And we think it's great that people are willing to take time and go let government hear from them, right? So we generally think that's a good thing, and so do we. But right, obviously, I think what we're showing here is there might be some, you know, there's some challenges there, right? I think there's some real challenging questions about how much should we prioritize the views of the figurative views, right? The perspectives of those, although literal views as well in some of these cases, right? The views of those who are going to be most affected by change in their neighborhood, right? Should we give them a little more say, a lot more say, no more say than the rest of the community, right? How do we balance kind of those, you know, community-wide or even region-wide voices and interests and perspectives versus those kind of the people closest to that are going to be most directly affected by a new building, by traffic, by things like that, right? And sort of finally, right, a natural question that comes up when we talk about this stuff, right, is some people are interested in reforms, right? And this is where we get to the very tentative data on what's going on now, right? Frequently people will say, well, these meetings are hard, you know, they take time, they're at a bad time of night, younger people don't have babysitting, like, you know, we agree with all of these things, but we are also somewhat skeptical that it's going to be, you're going to make a lot of progress on changing the composition of who shows up, just by kind of making it a little easier or whatever, right? And part of this comes not from these types of things, but from something that is a much lower cost activity for people, which is, it's hard to get people to change whether they're going to vote or not. Like most people, you know, even like the best interventions to try to get out the vote, maybe move people, you know, a few percentage points at most. So getting people through practical things to go to a meeting they otherwise were not interested in going to is, you know, is hard, right? It's also not even clear if we made meetings easier to go to, who the next people to show up would be. They might also be the objectors. It's not obvious that the next people who almost want to go but can't because they can't get a babysitter, or can't because, you know, they have something else to do, or can't because they're not quite motivated enough, you know, not clear what their views would be anyway. And so, right, we have started to look at this, right, once COVID hit, some faster than others, but a lot of cities and towns moved public meetings onto Zoom and similar forums. I want to caution, and this is why I didn't make graphs or whatever, this is very tentative, so please interpret with a big grain of salt, because it's only from the first couple months. A lot of the proposals that these meetings were about had already been ongoing, so people were already kind of in the process. But for what it's worth, we don't see a magic bullet here either. Our look at sort of who participates in online meetings that don't require leaving the house, don't require giving up hours of your time, right? Allow you to kind of sort of listen in and then get ready when you want to make your comment or whatever, right? They reduce all those types of barriers, and may in some ways impose bigger technological barriers on some of the people who tend to show up in person, right? We find a lot of the exact same inequalities in terms of home ownership, even age, you know, all these types of things. So we don't see yet, again, it's very early, but no magic bullet, right? You don't get a dramatic change in who shows up to an online zoning board meeting than an in-person one, at least what we're seeing so far, right? And the reason is because, you know, this is like real basic kind of social science and life stuff, but concentrated costs and diffuse benefits are really hard to overcome, right? There's a big motivation gap, and it's, you know, it's structural. And so I will stop there. Sorry, I probably went longer than I planned to. There's the book. So thank you all. And again, happy to answer questions. Also just happy to let a discussion kind of take off and hear planning board stories, and, you know, whatever happens.
Great, thank you, David.
Let's see, let me stop.
That was a very interesting presentation. I hope that you know, you all found that interesting. I think it's very interesting data to see, and we appreciate you sharing that with us today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Judy Barrett with Barrett Planning Group.
Hi, everybody.
Judy is a long time planning professional, has many years and hours of experience in public meetings. And so we would like to turn the floor over to her to lead a quick facilitated discussion. So I'm going to open the floor now for some either comments, thoughts, questions. Again, I ask that you use either the raise your hand function or the chat function, or a combination of the two, and we'll get to as many of you as we can during this next little bit here. So the floor is open. Judy, you want to kick us off?
Do we have any raised hands, first of all, before I sort of jump in and start asking any questions? I'd like to make sure we don't skip over people who've already decided they are just dying to ask a question. Heather, I see you shaking your head.
I don't see anyone yet.
Okay, so I'll just start picking on people then. So I know we have a kind of a mixed group here, and I guess I'm just curious to know, say, local employers who might be in this meeting. To what extent can you comment on how housing may have affected the hiring process that you go through? People being able to find housing that's affordable to them or reasonably close to work. What's the impact been on the employment situation in terms of housing access, which, you know, relates, of course, to how easy or difficult it is to get housing produced in the region? Oh, come on, guys, don't be so quiet. No responses?
Anyone?
how about, I'm just looking at the names of our participants here and trying to pick on, you know, some professions that might have something to say.
Judy,
Yes.
Peter Foreman.
Hi.
Can't find the raise the hand feature on this now.
Whoa.
A question, the figures on oppose and support were in the aggregate over all the projects you studied. Were you able to break down examples of some of particularly good strategies where there were more supporters than opponents at something, either because the developer linked so many goodies to their project that nobody opposed, or that they had done enough pre-selling in the neighborhood that people didn't oppose? Did you find cases where there were more supporters than opposers, and what drove that?
That's a very good question. So I don't think we don't have it that systematically. So I can't flag like particular projects or types of projects or things like that. To your last point though, anecdotally, there were definitely cases in which, somewhat, I don't know if typical or not, but somewhat regular sort of supporting comment we would see is, the developer's been very reasonable. They talked to us, they've handled this correctly, and, therefore I support the project or something like this, right? So it's hard to know exactly what was in the background there, but there are no doubts that there were instances when people did feel like, their views had been taken into account up front, that they had been treated, nicely, whether that means goodies or just courtesy. It's not clear necessarily from the comments. So I think you're onto something there, but I don't have it more, rigorously than that.
I'm wondering if we have any, I think we do. Oh, we have a hand raised before I finish asking my question. Betsy's got her hand raised.
Go ahead and call on Betsy.
All right. Hello, I'm Betsy Cowan-Neptune. I'm the Chief of Economic Development at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and thanks so much for putting this together. I'm just curious in the data whether there were comments or participation from employers, so to Peter's question, and whether you were able to get to that level, and also just kind of what people felt about that. I can see it being a positive and a negative depending on kind of, especially thinking about the data around the 41% lived on the block in terms of the comments. So just curious, again, thinking about the audience and the role that employers play, particularly in advocating for housing improvements. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's great. Again, we didn't systematically exactly code for that, but what we did observe, and again, I'd be curious if other folks who have, put proposals through or been to meetings, is that frequently, and this is, I think, part of the meeting dynamics that we think are interesting, is frequently the only person kind of speaking for it is the developer, who may not be, well, they may be an outsider, there may be various other, right? They're kind of an easy target for so yeah, basically long answer, or long story, is that yes, frequently there were not, whether it was any kind of sort of organized advocacy on behalf of kind of a broader, more diffuse interest. There were some opponents who brought their lawyers, or who brought, their local city councilor or something like that. There was frequently on the opposition side an indication of organization. But there were many cases in which there was, we didn't see a lot of, this will create jobs. I'm a business owner and my employees need to live here. Or even, I own a construction company and this is good for us. Like we frequently would get asked about that. Like, why can't there be a coalition of, realtors and construction unions and things like that? And we just, at least from what we saw, we didn't see a lot of it.
So we have a question in the chat that I think is worth exploring here, and it's from Ned Corcoran. To what extent did the threat of Chapter 40B play into project approvals?
Yeah, good question. So again, I keep saying we didn't code this systematically. It'd be really hard to get, and but there are definitely, I think if we wanted to write up a couple case studies of like, what gets even a very modest proposal built in a place like Weston, you'll find in the background a bigger 40B threat kind of lurking around. I mean, there are definitely, and again, I suspect you may know this asking the question, but there are definitely cases where, they the regular process for a pretty modest proposal was done in the shadow of people saying, this is how we stay away from the 40B. So whether that means 40B is working or not, I guess is open to interpretation, but there are definitely examples of that. I can't say it, the threat of 40B leads to X% increase in things getting approved, but and our data doesn't go back before 40B. And unfortunately, we just looked at, the 3 most recent years when we started doing this. That'd be a really interesting question to the extent that at least some communities do still have those records, but it definitely comes up. And it is probably one of the arguments that supporters might sometimes make is, this is better than the 40B that we're going to get otherwise.
I think we have another question in the chat. I'll take these kind of, as they come through, and if the chat starts to slow down, I actually have some questions of my own here. But did you notice in your research, or perhaps anybody who's in the meeting may want to comment on this as well, if there's been an increase in kind of mixed use projects with commercial and residential being developed in the more suburban communities in the region? Has anybody seen this? And also in your cases that you looked at, were there any mixed use cases, and did those seem to play out at all any differently from, say, something that was all housing?
I can comment. This is Ned Corcoran. I can comment on Milton. We've had a combination of things. One, we've had rezoning in the last 10 to 15 years where housing was added to facilitate the redevelopment of commercial properties, old, small commercial areas that would not otherwise redevelop themselves without the additional value that would come from residential upstairs while you're subsidizing either parking and or some form of business commercial downstairs. On the other side, that when you get outside of our 2 small commercial areas, and even now in one of our commercial areas, 40B has been the legitimate alternative to what I call pushing the edge of reasonable on real estate development. So Milton is only at 4%, closing in on 5% of affordability. So for me and my clients, that's the hammer that I can just quietly lay on the table to use as the alternative to what we try to do with reasonably scaled, scaled larger than what would otherwise be allowed under zoning, but what I think is reasonably scaled, high value, good return to the community if new zoning in those cases gets adopted.
Thank you. Others, any thoughts on whether you're seeing an increase in mixed use projects around the South Shore, and do those seem to be getting greeted any differently, perhaps from an all multifamily development? And David, I didn't know if you had seen anything in your research that might somehow distinguish those 2 types of applications as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, just thinking back at some of the ones we read, I mean, there are definitely some in there, and they tend to be bigger projects. So I think by virtue of that, they tend to bring out, more organized participation. And, obviously, I think part of our argument is the more pieces there are, the more opportunities there are to find something wrong with it, or, things to negotiate over. And so again, anecdotally, there were some, I suspect some of the ones that generated the most comments and just the most activity and the most meetings were mixed use, right? There's probably disputes over, what's the right parking is even more complicated if there's a retail component and a residential component. So I think that's all, we definitely saw some of that. They probably generate, you're going to get a lot more activity on those than converting trying to build a 3-family or, set up 2 adjacent townhouses or something like that. I don't know. I know we looked to make sure that we weren't just finding negativity by being dominated by big controversial projects, and that's definitely not the case. But there is no doubt that there were some in there that generate a lot of activity, and it's not clear to me that it helps. It generates a lot more activity, but maybe that's good. Maybe there's more to negotiate over, and I'm not sure.
Any other thoughts on that question, on the issue about mixed use? Because if not, we have yet another question in the chat that I think we should take a look at from Katie Lacey at Mass Housing Partnership. Whether anybody, David or you, or anyone else on the call has a sense of whether the remote participation hearings have resulted in more participation or more diverse participation. And I'll just say confessionally, I happen to be on the Zoning Board of Appeals in my own town, so I have a definite opinion about this, but I won't impose it on you. So I'd like to hear what people think about the remote participation that's been going on since, mid-March, late March. We have at least one hand raised. Ned, if you hold on, there was somebody else who had a hand raised. We'll get to you maybe second. Just let other people
Sure.
speak. Courtney, are you the one who's opening people up to speak or not? I'm not sure if it's you.
Yeah, I am, but he popped off. I don't know where he is. Bob, there you are. Okay.
Thank
Bob,
you.
muted you.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
We
Yep.
can hear you.
Great. Bob Luongo, I'm the planning director for the town of Weymouth.
Hi, Bob.
I, David, enjoyed your presentation. Weymouth, we have not seen more participation through our Zoom meetings, which I was surprised at. We get a lot of participation on social media.
Yeah.
I'm finding that people like to, quote unquote, mouth off on social media pages, and then when it comes to the public hearing, fail to participate in the process during the public hearing, which I find that a little bit strange that happens. But in any case, so far we have a lot of people who turn into the meetings on Zoom, but not any more public comment, which again surprised me. We get more public comment, pro and negative, on Facebook than we actually get through the public hearing process.
Thanks, Bob. Did anyone else?
I think Ned.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've participated in probably a dozen meetings, hearings by Zoom, but it's unusual for a hearing that is contested, particularly substantially contested, to move forward. Often I'm finding that those hearings are being continued for quite some time until you can get to a meeting where people can be present. I had one contested hearing, went through the town of Milton planning board, where it was continued 4 times until they decided to conduct a hearing. And it was just difficult to be in that process, because you don't get to look at people, read the room, you keep going on. Very difficult forum, I think, to conduct reasonably a hearing where you're trying to get to a decent outcome. And so it's really become, I found it's become difficult. If you have a hearing that's not contested, it can move through quickly, it's very efficient, because it might take you 10 or 15 minutes to get through a hearing that otherwise might take you half an hour to 45 minutes. So those are managed more efficiently. We had one last thing I'll say is we had town meeting this summer, and there were some zoning amendments that were going before town meeting. That was a particularly difficult thing. I had a particular argument involved in one, and after a while I had the feeling that 80% of the people who were town meeting members who were watching were just waiting for the vote. They were getting up. I was talking to a blank screen. I couldn't see who I was talking to. They couldn't see they couldn't see me. And I was trying to make an argument that was somewhat technical in nature. And I think people were getting up, going to, refill their drink. If you wouldn't come back and sit down and say, well, is this over yet? Can we vote? So it's been a difficult time and a difficult process to engage in substantive change, whether it's on a particular project basis or more broadly, where you don't have all of the contestants in the room at the same time, and they're not having discussions. That's the experience I've had. I don't know about Judy, you or others involved in any of these types of meetings.
Well, we have a hand raised, so we should probably take that person's comments, but I actually do want to respond, Ned, but I'll hold on for a minute.
Okay.
Hi, Mark Styles Law. I'm not sure how my connection is. I can hear everybody great, but I'm in the basement of our office because we've created a schoolhouse here for some of the staff's kids. So I just was checking in and jumped into the call. I am currently on the Zoning Board of Appeals in Marshfield. And like many things with COVID, we'd rather it be done differently, right? But everybody's doing the best that they can. I'm not so sure that these hearings aren't going to be appealable based on some of the requirements of open meeting. I see down the road that things could be challenged based on how these meetings are conducted because there's technical deficiencies. Not everybody is really adept to Zoom and the technologies needed. Especially those that might be objecting. I feel for the applicants who are utilizing Zoom for the very first time. It's painful, quite frankly. And sitting through these meetings it's tough. It's really tough. But like COVID, this is one of the many things that we're dealing with, right? Everything is a little bit more challenging. We are hoping to get back into a spatially safe space sooner than later. We do have facilities in Marshfield that I think we could utilize, but right now we're not moving in that direction yet. But it's challenging, and the sooner we get through this, the better for everybody: applicants, volunteers, and objectors. Just quickly talking about the multiple use properties, the mixed use. Marshfield has created some overlay districts that allow for mixed use. We love it. We talked about this on one of Peter Foreman's CEO chats, which was an awesome format, Peter. I do miss those dearly from Tuesday mornings. Those were great. And we talked about those mixed use concepts and how wonderful they can be for all parties. The win-win-win of it, with the developer can maximize the profits. There's new housing stock, and the town is generating some new tax base. So we're big fans of it. We'd like to see more towns utilizing it. And as for COVID, let's put that in the rearview mirror. But thank you for your time, and thank you for this wonderful content in these times that are so challenging, to continue to be giving us really good solid information.
Any other hands up? I don't think so. So confessionally, I'm on the ZBA in Duxbury, and I wear two hats. Actually, I wear several hats in this meeting, but I also serve Mass Housing Partnership as a consultant to boards of appeal that are dealing with Chapter 40B projects. So I've seen this in a couple of different ways. And as a ZBA member, I actually appreciate Zoom, and I'll tell you why. Although I grant that everything Mark just said is true, there are some technical difficulties. Sometimes people are more or less comfortable working with the technology than others. But I would say, as a board member, one of the things I've appreciated is not having a room full of abutters who could sort of gang up on the applicant and start applauding because someone speaks opposed to the project, and this sort of energy builds up in the room that I think makes it kind of hard for the board. But in Zoom, that doesn't happen. So in some ways, I kind of appreciate it. I do think for the boards I've worked with, it's kind of all over the lot. I work with towns that made the transition to Zoom almost seamlessly, and their populations seem to make the transition almost seamlessly. And I think there are communities where there's like more capacity and frankly more household wealth, and people just kind of have that capability to just sort of make the switch. The boards that I work with that are in not so affluent communities, it's all over the lot. Sometimes the applicants are perfectly comfortable doing a presentation, but the board members are trying to figure out how to mute themselves and unmute themselves, and just are not familiar at all with, with just the tools of Zoom. One of my clients, the planning director, sensing the difficulty people were having, put out a request one day through the town website to anybody who wanted to learn how to use Zoom. and she would do a technical assistance session to train people, her boards, the residents, anybody who was having trouble. And I said, you need to put that on your website so people can see it later. And I think that she has. So that was an example of a planner who kind of tried to sort of deal with this problem of everybody not having equal comfort with the technology, even in a community where probably most people have decent internet access. So, you know, I think communities are kind of trying to make the best of this that they can, but the experience has definitely not been uniform. Other thoughts? So I know we have a couple of developers on this call. I'm wondering if we have, you know, any land use attorneys or engineers or architects or people who tend to represent applicants before sitting in town boards, and what your experience has been with, you know, with the public hearing process and how that's kind of gone for you. Whether you think there's perhaps ways to somehow encourage participation, but also not let it take over the hearing, and perhaps, you know, in a way that is more than it perhaps should. Where are you guys? No comments?
Joe, Mark, Ned.
Carol said she'd speak.
Yeah.
Oh, Carol, great.
I'm
Sorry.
sorry.
Hi, Courtney. Thank you. Judy, my name is Carol Bowman. I'm the president CEO of Jack Conway Company.
Yep. Hi.
And this isn't specifically what you asked, but I thought it would give a little bit of color to what we're experiencing from a buyer and seller point of view with COVID. You know, first of all, I loved what you said about the communication using Zoom. You know, we have had to learn new ways of communicating. I mean, it's really not a choice. I mean, it's a must. I mean, we're doing it right now. And I think seeing the way so many businesses have adapted is truly inspiring in a lot of cases. And I think that the companies that are able to adapt are the ones that will truly succeed through all of this. And I think the same goes to the towns. You know, people are able to adapt to the way the communication style, you know, it can be very successful. I've been on a couple of town meetings during COVID, and people struggling a little bit, but they're showing up. And sometimes they can show up when they couldn't show up in person. So I think there's a lot of benefit. But from the Jack Conway Company perspective, you would ask the questions about employers. Are you seeing any opportunities with, you know, the employment situation? And what we've seen from a real estate perspective is so many employers are not only allowing or encouraging or even insisting that their employees work from home right now remotely, but they're actually planning for a long time to come. Mm-hmm. And so what we're seeing from a buyer demand situation is many people, I'm sure you guys know this, you're hearing this in newspapers and on the radio and online, many people are having very immense life-changing thought processes where they're moving from the city to the suburbs. They're looking for a home office, maybe a home gym because they can't go to the gym. So because of everything that COVID has changed in our lives, there's a lot of behavior changes. So what we're seeing is new listings. For a while there was an incredible problem with inventory, with listings, our inventory. And as you know, housing stock there's a lot of older housing stock in Massachusetts. And because of the, lack of open land in our area, and also some of the zoning restrictions, it's difficult to be able to keep up with the demand of the buyers. We did see, for your own information, for everybody on this call, we had actually 70% increase in new listings taken last month than we did the same month the year before. So we're still down slightly in the number of listings, so unit count that we had this time last year, but we've seen an enormous uptick over the last couple months because, let's face it, people selling are seeing that they can sell their properties for more money. So the biggest challenge we're having as realtors, and what our buyers and our sellers are having, is the lack of property available to them. So, you know, that comes right back to your discussion. So I just wanted to provide that little bit of color as we go through this discussion. Thank you very much, Judy. Appreciate this topic.
So I see Ned's hand raised. I'm just wondering if anybody else Ned, I'm not ignoring you. I just want to
I
make
know,
sure.
I appreciate that.
But you are assertive and you are the only hand I see raised, so the
Well,
floor
you
is.
asked a really good question about, going forward and how are we managing. When I take on a new fairly large project in Milton, and the first thing I do is I rent the large conference room at the library, and I invite everyone who's at least within 300 feet of the property line to come to a neighborhood meeting, and generally it's much broader than that. And I try to get 2 or 3 of them before I begin the process of filing any applications, whether it's with the planning board or the ZBA or both. And right now, I don't know how I would start a new large project because you can't conduct those meetings. And I find that those meetings go a long way towards reducing the sting. You identify issues, you try to come up with solutions, and you can break issues down in a way that by the time you start the public process, you've kind of, you've gone a long way to yes. You don't always get to yes, and sometimes you've got dog fights to go through as you're getting to the public process. But I don't know how I would start a new project that was of real substance today, because you can't conduct those meetings. I don't know if others would have a similar experience.
That's a good point. Thank you, Ed. There is a comment in the chat that I somehow missed here, and I want to make sure we catch it. It's from Krista at Care Architecture about an increase in addition design requests on people's homes. I wondered if you wanted to just comment on that as kind of a little indicator of what's going on with the market. Krista, you still on the call?
Hi, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I've actually seen quite a lot of increase in requests on additions for master suites on people's existing homes. I've had a bunch of projects where their existing home is like a tiny little 800 square foot tiny home, and a lot of people are more than doubling the size of their house. Right. Which to me is interesting. I mean, it's definitely a result of COVID, because a lot of these projects, the people are like, well, I'm now permanently working at home, so right. I need more space.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions or comments here that I can't see? Courtney and Heather, I'm so dependent on you.
It looks like Bob might have his hand raised for a comment or a question.
Oh, Bob.
Thank you. Just to answer Ned's question, how would you go about starting a large project during COVID? So in Weymouth, we are in the process of permitting a fairly large project, 86 units. It's a conversion of an industrial building into residential, plus a small new construction component, but it's going to be 86 units. Mm-hmm. So the planning department in Weymouth, I kind of like step out of the role as regulator and kind of like put myself into more of a proactive role. So what we've done here for this project in particular is we've engaged the district town council, obviously, and we sent out perhaps, we don't go like 300 feet from, abutters to abutters. We sent out, we drew a circle around the project area, and we probably got 100, 150 people. We did a mailing from the assessor's records, invited them to a Zoom meeting, gave them the information on it. And then we had, in this particular meeting, I think we had 50 participants over, so we sent out maybe over 100, maybe 150 letters, invited them to a public meeting over Zoom. We got about 50 people responding to it. We had the developer do a presentation. This is before he filed anything with the Board of Appeals We took questions and concerns, and then based on that feedback, we then prepared, developer prepared his application to go before the Zoning Board of Appeals. So I think it can be done. Again, we take a role in Weymouth, and we're a little bit more proactive. I understand most towns, they leave it to the devices of a developer on his own to figure it out. But I think it can be done, and this process we've gone through. So the public hearing has been continued to this week, but it's been fairly positive feedback, neutral to positive. The major concern was some traffic, and we're dealing with that issue. But I think it can be done. It's not a perfect world out there, but we did do a public process, and it worked for us anyways.
Thanks, Bob. Judy, we have a hand raised by Paul, and then we'll take the last question in the chat, and then we'll probably wrap for today. Just to be cognizant of everyone's time. We're a little bit over, so if you have to jump off, that's fine. But just want to take a couple more questions and toss it back to David if he has any closing comments, and then we'll wrap.
So does Paul have the floor?
Paul has the floor.
Great.
Hello.
Paul, you're on. Can't hear you.
I can't either.
Okay, let's try again. Paul, maybe shoot your question in the chat, and we'll try and get that answered. And then in the meantime, we can hear from Martine. Yep, you're good.
I was just curious, now that several of our, we've been talking about how do we do more transit development, especially with what's happening on the corridor for 18. Have we seen is this possibly a way for those of us who've been doing this for a long time to sort of do the joint venture, to start to work with our merchants a little more and see if there are restaurateurs or proprietors or shop owners who might want to extend and get their variances elsewhere. But I have talked to many merchants who are making outside permanent structures. Towns are allowing them. So can we jump on this bandwagon as housing development folks and be able to maybe use it to our advantage?
Anybody have any thoughts on Martine's question?
Always a positive on my end, Judy. I'm trying.
I know.
So I've tried in a few limited cases with our push for housing to suggest to people that Main Street retail is now, or Main Street businesses are now a more questionable proposition. And if towns want to see businesses on Main Street, they may have to think about being more flexible on anchoring that investment with housing up above. Now, I haven't found a parade of people walking outside my side saying, yeah, you convinced me. But I do think that everyone is aware of what can happen to their downtowns if stores close, and there will be more sympathy to helping support those property owners, knowing that that is not always a secure investment on the first floor, but housing up above can.
I always hear fairly receptive response to ideas like that as long as the units are one-bedroom units. We won't go there this afternoon. That was my little dig.
Thank you.
So
sorry, Martine, you knew I had to say that, right?
Sorry, I think, yeah.
Paul, are you back?
Yeah, what is?
Oh, there
yes,
we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
The connection is brutal. I apologize for this. I just wanted to thank everybody, introduce myself, happy to be here, looking forward to the next few sessions. So my name is Paul Caleri. I also wear a couple of hats, real estate broker as well. Happy to see some of my colleagues on here. Carol, good to see you. Good to hear from you. Mark Stiles, always a pleasure. So I am the broker at Dream Realty, and also I'm on the planning board in my town in Cohasset. And I feel like the information that was put forward today is super helpful for all of us moving forward during these challenging times. Ned, appreciated all your insight. You know, one of the things I think that should be looked at closely, I mean, it seems to me like we're all, and I'll try to make this as brief as I can because I know that everyone's busy and we want to wrap this. So, but Philip is that putting full, yep, did you lose me again?
You're good.
You still have me?
We do.
Okay, great. So I was just going to say quickly, like in some of these mixed use developments that are being brought before our towns in the South Shore, you know, I think COVID's taught us a lot, and others had touched upon it, like Carol and the like. You know, that a lot of people are working remotely from home. And so I think this utilization of ground floor commercial space is going to look differently in the near future, in the short term, and I think indefinitely for a lot of these business owners that realize they can have a lot of their employees working from home. So it's a concern to me as a planning board member, like we're going to be approving properties. I don't want to approve something and hold a developer to some guidelines or restrictions that X amount of the space needs to be commercially utilized if we realize that the commercial real estate aspect is going to be, you know, I think struggling maybe. The housing seems to be okay, and like everyone is benefiting in terms of sales and renovations and architectural and contractors across the board. Everyone's so busy. But the commercial aspect of things, you know, I think we want to be mindful and tread lightly and those kinds of things. So I guess I don't know if I have a question, but I'm just kind of putting it out there that we, I think collectively as this group of people who are showing some interest in the housing stock in the South Shore, we should be mindful of that moving forward and just, you know, let's have the open conversation because it's a real situation and it should be talked about, you know? So that's all. Super grateful to be here. Happy to be among my colleagues. And, you know, I feel like being in the real estate business for 15 years, but I feel like I'm just, you know, I'm very humbled by all the experience in the room. So thank you all.
Thank you, Paul. All right, well, I'll go ahead and just wrap us up for today. I appreciate your time this afternoon and joining us for what we think is a very important conversation around housing and kind of how we collectively as a business community, as you know, industry experts, kind of help move the conversation along on increasing housing production across the region in a real way and in a productive way. And very happy to have everyone here. I will follow up with a recording for any of you who want to watch this again. And also just want to thank David very much for your time, for your presentation, super informative for all of us. And I hope we'll see you all again very soon at the next session, which is on Tuesday, the 27th of October. We're going to talk about transit-oriented developments and what that means and what that can mean. So enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll hopefully see you all soon. Signing off.